Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the second episode of Behind the Buzz, where we're going to be exploring translating science to policy with our wonderful guests, Andrew Gonzalez from GEO BON and Aidin Niamir from IPBES. As a reminder, this is part of a larger series being supported by the Smithsonian and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation that's really exploring the science policy interface. I'm Talia Speaker with Wild Labs at the World Wildlife Fund, and I'm joined by my co-host, Lacey Huey at the Smithsonian Movement of Life program. And again, as a reminder from last time, this series is kind of exploring different components at the science policy interface, going all the way from global frameworks all the way through to country level applications and how we fund and finance implementation of policy in the science space. So please do keep an eye out for these next events coming up. And we're also grounding this season in animal movement, kind of building on some recent work by Wild Labs and also other partners, including our Tracking Progress series that some of you attended, as well as our Movement Ecology Horizon Scan. And that work really highlighted some pretty significant gaps in terms of integration of movement policy or movement data into policy frameworks. So we're really looking at how we can mobilize an informed global community of practice to help to meet those gaps. And the last piece of context kind of going into these events is just that we know it can be kind of overwhelming for the scientists and innovators in our community to engage in the global policy space. So we really want this to be like a safe and open space. So please feel free to ask questions that you may feel are dumb questions, because if you're wondering them, probably other people are too. And so with that, Lacey, I'll hand it over to you to give some more context on the movement ecology side of things.
Thanks so much, Talia, and it's great to see everyone here. I'm excited to be together again with these great speakers. So I've been working with Talia, Aidin, Andy, and a whole team of people to develop this new biodiversity observation network for animal movement, really focused on mobilizing the movement community in support of global biodiversity policy. And this initiative is the result of a proposal that was written by the Smithsonian Institution, Wild Labs, NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, Senckenberg, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and the University of Central Florida. And it's leading into a workshop in the spring that's funded by the Smithsonian and NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. And you can find out more about it by visiting the Movement Ecology group on Wild Labs.
And with that, we are so excited, as I mentioned, to have Andrew Gonzalez from GEO BON and Aidin Niamir from IPBES here with us today to explore this kind of translation of science to policy and the institutions that play a really important role in that translation work. And we think that, yeah, these two speakers are really wonderful representatives of institutions that are really important in the space. And we also know that we ran out of time for a lot of the questions and discussion last event. So that's why we've extended this event to 90 minutes. So we're really hoping to get to some of those meaty questions that came up in the chat last time. So with that, Andy, we're going to pass the screen over to you. And Lacey will do a little introduction to you as you get set up.
Thanks, Talia. So we're really thrilled to welcome Dr. Andrew Gonzalez, who's the co-chair of GEO BON and the IPBES Assessment on Biodiversity Monitoring, and the chair in Biodiversity Conservation at McGill University. Andy's work focuses on bridging cutting-edge ecological research with real-world policy applications, making him a leading voice in the global effort to translate biodiversity data into actionable policy. He's also playing a key advisory role in the development of the Move On initiative, helping to shape our collective vision for integrating animal movement data into global biodiversity frameworks. You can take it away, Andy.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Lacey. Thank you, Talia. Thank you both and Wild Labs for setting up this webinar. This, for me, is very exciting to be part of Behind the Buzz. And as always, I'm very happy to be on stage, so to speak, with Aidin, who's an awesome colleague and is helping me connect to IPBES and bridge our two amazing organizations. So allow me to share really some background on what is GeoBon and what are we doing, and some of my own reflections and thoughts on how we can bridge the work that you're all doing in the research and applied science space into the most pressing issue of our time, is how to deliver on the global biodiversity framework. Since December 2022, we have a new vision. We have a new theory of change in place, succinctly called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And this framework sets out 4 ambitious goals to be achieved by 2050 and 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. Crucial to this is this idea of what we are saying colloquially as bending the curve of biodiversity. That means switching from a trajectory that it would be considered to be in a long-term unsustainable erosion of biological diversity in different ways, at different dimensions of biodiversity, and the many benefits and contributions that people receive from that. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But what's key, I think, for the purposes of this talk is that we have a brand new monitoring framework with the GBF. This is something that was not formalized in the previous Aichi targets. And so what does that mean? That means that it's asking countries to consistently report their progress in terms of bending the curve of nature, and reporting their progress across the headline indicators, of the targets and goals. Now, when we mean a monitoring framework, there's the UN speak, and then there's what we might all be thinking about. And so we include in that monitoring both the observations of nature, the movement of animals, the dispersal of plants, the levels of genetic species and ecosystem diversity and the functioning of those ecosystems. But we also mean the translation of that knowledge into policy relevant indicators and the reporting of that progress, a reliable process of going from observations to the reporting of progress. And that is what many organizations around the world are trying to institutionalize right now, and to set up a culture, a robust, open science culture for supporting countries with their monitoring frameworks. Now, here is a smattering of words from the GBF document, and I put in blue things that are relevant to this group. In just 3 paragraphs here, you can see the word connectivity, and is explicit in the framing of target 2 around restoration, target 3 around protected areas. And I think it's important to take home that we don't just mean the connectivity of protected areas, but we mean connectivity at large, in the spaces between those connected areas, in the spaces where people are living, of course, and even in Goal B on ecosystem services and nature's contribution to people, we see already, for example, in Target 12 on cities, that connectivity is embedded in that wording. So getting this community on board and engaged in the movement and connectivity question is vital to the success of these targets and many others in the GBF framework. Now, let me take you from the biggest picture possible. This is the landscape of what we're trying to achieve. On the right, you see the UN CBD and the GBF framework interacting over time with IPBES and the community that's trying to assess the knowledge we have and to understand how the framing of the GBF matches with the overall knowledge that we are aggregating and synthesizing via IPBES and its various assessments. And on the left, you're seeing the global science and NGO and local communities that are committed to monitoring biodiversity change, understanding how that is happening at different spatial and temporal scales across different realms, from freshwater, marine, and terrestrial systems. And our goal is to couple both sides of this figure. So how can we support the assessment of progress, us in our community on the left there, supporting those organizations on the right, and how do their policies, actions, and coordination of the knowledge assessment process on the right feed into our own priorities, and which organizations can stand up at this point and support this cycle. GeoBon is one of those critical organizations, and that little animation in the middle there is really an attempt to convey that we're expecting collaborations among organizations and among countries. Those could be bilateral and they could be multilateral, but they're part of this new system of systems that we're trying to build to inform our opportunity to meet those targets. Now, in this paper, just before COP15 in December of 2022, my co-chair, Maria Cecilia Londoño at the Humboldt Institute in Colombia, we put together some of the key issues that we felt needed to be addressed as we try to ready the biodiversity monitoring community for this action framing, this theory of change. And here is a list of the things we felt are critical and that were repeatedly expressed by countries. One is that there are significant data and indicator gaps, meaning in the context of movement, that means the availability of movement data and the availability of movement EBVs, as I'll get to in a minute, what an EBV is, and then the indicators we might use to support policy based on that knowledge. There are issues around, profound issues around data sovereignty, who gets to use information that's generated, who gets to share that data, who makes that available, and of course, all the potential inequities that may arise from that and that exist today, but we want to minimize moving forward. Thirdly, that there are important workflows that allow us to take observations of movement or any aspect of nature and turn those reliably, transparently, and robustly into indicators. That right now is not done in a smooth and effective manner. Statistically, we want to be able to do very strong detection of change and attribution of the causes of that change, and to be able to act on that through a formal detection attribution framework, not least for movement, but of course all dimensions of biodiversity. And then that fifth piece is thinking about multilateral collaboration and for better outcomes, which is ultimately why we're all here. Now, on this slide, you're seeing kind of what's in my brain about how I think those two sides of that figure work together. On the demand of data production and sharing, number one, into the monitoring science, number two, planning and prioritization to meet our targets and goals, and then ultimately onto reporting. And you can think of it like a recipe. There are multiple ingredients that go into making this an effective workflow, a streamlined workflow where we've got representation and engagement from across those communities, from the observation communities, the formal and informal monitoring that's going on nationally and internationally. So GBio stands for the Global Biodiversity Observing System we're trying to build, the various technologies that are used and involved in that monitoring process, and then the monitoring science that provides layers of data, both in situ and remotely sensed, the knowledge services that allow us to turn those models and data sets into metrics and indicators that can then feed into the kind of smorgasbord of offerings that countries may want to use. These include the headline indicators, the binary indicators, the component, complementary, and national indicators that every country pulls together as they're defining their national biodiversity strategy and action plan that you see in orange. And it's from these indicators that they report their progress to the UNCBD. And then the UNCBD is committed from that reporting to aggregate understanding. So you can see how well this piece on the right is done depends fundamentally on how well we do on the left here, and how well we mobilize this movement community and establish a movement BON, Biodiversity Observation Network, and the indicators and models that flow from that are crucial to being able to streamline this process so that we are adequately supporting the policy context. So this is where GEOBON comes in. GEOBON's mission is to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. We support and provide a number of indicators, and of course provide models that allow us to make projections of the status of those indicators and EBVs. And we try to deliver those in an open science framework to a broad set of users, as broad a set as possible. GEOBON is basically 15 years old now. It has accumulated 3,500 registered members. It's free to join and be part of this community, scattered across 150 countries, no less, and 1,800 organizations. So it's a remarkable community of experts. Over those 15 years, we've really focused on three things: developing the EBV framework, and most recently, the Essential Ecosystem Services framework, which complements the EBV framework. the indicators that are built from those EBVs, and developing this community of biodiversity observation networks, which is really building a coalition of the willing. Those are really willing to stand up a BON and engage with the rest of the BONs in the world. And then doing so in a way that is obviously made available to multilateral environmental agreements like the KMGBF, but of course like the Convention on Migratory Species, the SDGs, or any other MEA. How do we do that, and what do we do? Well, it's a hooking up of the research and observation community with the assessment and policy communities, meeting user needs in this iterative cycle shown by the gray square going around. GeoBon is built of working groups and task forces, and anyone can build a working group, and anyone can contribute to a task force. And so historically, we've had working groups that have developed EBVs, essential biodiversity variables, on a range of topics. Some of them you see here. We do not currently have an EBV for movement group, but that is an obvious thing that could be built immediately. And in addition to those working groups, we've had task forces on policy, for example, but also working groups that have contributed to the development of the biodiversity observation networks, and how the knowledge contributed by these working groups and task forces can feed into these policy assessment and policy processes. So that is what we've been busy doing at any given time, and what the Secretariat of GeoBon, which is based here in Montreal at McGill University, is dedicated to supporting the work of this very large and active community. And what our biggest, highest level mission is to fill in a gap. What you're seeing on this slide is the obvious absence of a global observing system that our climate community has, a range of weather and climate observing systems for all realms of our biosphere, and that supports the IPCC process. We do not have the equivalent to support the IPBES and the UN CBD process. And so GeoBon is really trying in the next few years to help stand up this network of networks, this BON of BONs that we call the Global Biodiversity Observing System. And so this has multiple components. The idea is to work with countries, but of course across countries, to support the engagement of that community in situ, the assessment of needs, the design of a BON, and the implementation of that BON, so that it's measuring the range of biodiversity indicators and those variables that we talked about earlier, and producing a knowledge service that can then be used as part of a collaborative international effort to measure the changing state of an EBV and ultimately those indicators, whether that's at the local scale, the regional, or global scales. So when we see a BON, this is what we see. We see a human component, networks of partners and organizations in the public and private sector collaborating around this data challenge, and then transforming that data into forms that can be used by partners to calculate indicators, feed into the policy process at different scales. And this is what we want to try to build. GeoBon has been successful in building a number of these. We have national BONs, a range of national BONs from China to Colombia to France to Finland. We've got regional collections of national BONs, like the Asia Pacific BON that connects 7 different countries. And then we've got these thematic BONs like marine BON, freshwater BON, and soil BON, where people are sharing technologies and knowledge that allow those communities represented by many different countries to share their understanding of how best to monitor change in those realms. And so you could imagine a thematic BON on movement, just as you could imagine national and regional BONs for movement. The idea is then, once we've built a BON, is that you've established a workflow from observations to EBVs and on up to the indicators. And here you see the list of indicators that GeoBon readily provides and has formalized that provision to the parties of the CBD. So that is one way in which the movement community can develop an EBV and a movement EBV, perhaps within the category of species traits, and on into the designation of contributing either to existing indicators or to the development of new indicators. I don't have too much time to go into what an EBV is. It's essentially a framework for collecting, sharing, and using biodiversity observations. It's done in a way that's open and open science using best, fair, and care principles. As you'll notice, there are 6 classes of EBVs, from genetics to populations to species traits, compositions of communities, and on to the structure and function of ecosystems. And so connectivity and movement pertains to all of these, of course, and we can have a long conversation about the value of movement EBVs. But they all share these qualities, and developing an EBV must ensure that we hit that they are policy relevant, feasible, sensitive to change, generalizable across realms, scalable in space and time, and are the basis for robust indicators. Here's just another way of showing that information, but now you read it from bottom to top. We're trying to build the sandwich, the layer here from the primary data of the observations with dimensions of space and time, through to the EBVs, into the indicators, and then supporting countries that might be mobilizing those indicators to report on those targets. As I finish up and wrap up here, just to say that GEO BON has been working for the last 2 years to offer an open platform. This is called BON in a Box. BON in a Box is a community-contributed assembly of code, data, and protocols that allow a country to feed data into EBV pipelines, so codes, scripts, that allow us to then systematically, for a given area or region of the planet, turn those EBV data cubes with dimensions of space, time, and biodiversity into those indicators. And what we're doing is working with the CBD Secretariat to pipe in, to provide an API from BON in a Box into the Convention on Biological Diversity's data framework, so that countries can more easily hook up their country-level monitoring science and data collection into this sort of standardized, rigorous process for reporting on this changing state of their indicators. Here is an example of what the BON in a Box viewer looks like. We're working with the country of Guinea in West Africa to help them think about how connected their protected areas are, you see in orange, and can we help them calculate indicators for the connectivity of their protected areas, and doing so with this community-contributed framework that BON in a Box offers. And so this is my last slide. It's my kind of challenge slide of what does a movement BON do? This is going to be fodder for conversation. I don't want to prescribe too much of this, but just to understand that what we're maybe trying to do in the process of brainstorming, creating, and standing up a movement BON that is gathering information about how organisms are moving in different ecosystems, contexts. How can we build robust evidence of movement change and connectivity change that feeds into these indicators that guide planning and conservation action, that can allow regular reporting to the CBD under its goals and targets? And how can that robust knowledge provide indicators of progress towards those connectivity targets that then support national reporting via this pathway, as well as this planning pathway? If we build this system, wow, we will have shifted the entire community to a level of maturity that will see it, I think, bear fruit in our capacity to deliver progress and bend the curve of connectivity and habitat loss, and ultimately for those contributions that we realize are essential to humanity as well as to nature in goals A and B of the GBF. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andy. Lots of fodder for discussion. So we're going to take a little bit of time to do Q&A. And it looks like, has anyone dropped? I don't think if you want to ask a new question, please drop it into the chat. I have one to kick us off that was pulled from some of the registration questions. So I think given that a lot of folks in the audience right now are kind of from the science or tech world, we often struggle with the level of information that people want. And so how would you advise us on like how to think about the getting our, pretty complicated movement models into a level of information or a format that would be meaningful to policymakers?
Wow. That's an important conversation, and with many layers to it. So ultimately, when you, for example, if you sit in on COP negotiations, I was there a lot in terms of the negotiations around the monitoring framework, and they are ongoing, and they were a sticky issue at COP16, and there will be a sticky issue probably at COP 16.2 in Rome in a couple of weeks. What you understand, what we appreciate is that the countries that are negotiating choices of indicators for movement, for example, are not aware of what the community is producing. There are a few countries would have scientists sitting on their delegations. Colombia is one of them. My dear co-chair Maria Cecilia sits on the Colombian delegation, so that they have an enormous head start. And she is able to work with those teams so that they can assess what is good and strong science. But that can't be ad hoc like that. So what we need is a community of this community to make readily available and to communicate clearly the state of readiness of our workflows, of our models, and the confidence that we have in those models that they can be used relatively readily by countries. So some countries are blessed with an institute, a Humboldt Institute, for example, where the government can lean on that institute for the relevant expertise. And so in the layer cake of information sharing and mainstreaming of that knowledge, it passes through that funnel. Now, the CBD has just developed a list of regional technical and scientific support centers. There are 23, I believe, around the world that are dedicated to working as this middle layer. And so what I'm excited about doing is to have GEO BON work with these 23 centers to kind of spread the word and support the implementation of let's stick to movement models and movement data. So imagine if we could provide those recipes, that knowledge, that confidence to those centers, and then they can work with countries that do not have a Humboldt or a SANBI or whatever the institution might be, the Smithsonian or whatever it is. So what I'm saying is that right now we have an ad hoc process. It's a bit random, and what gets selected in a negotiation is not necessarily built on a widely acknowledged and widely understood knowledge base. So it's upon us as a community, and that's why GEO BON exists in part, is to streamline that information, get it into the hands of those that are negotiating, but then crucially beyond the negotiations, getting that into a ready culture of use of this information and knowledge. And those centers are a good way to go.
That's great, Andy. I was, as you were talking, wondering about these centers and if there was a connection there. So that's really exciting to hear, and something to explore more. I think Lacey and I have more questions we can maybe save for the broader discussion, but it looks like there are a couple in the chat. I'm not sure, Omar, do you have a mic that you could jump in with?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay. Oh, yes. Yeah, go for it.
Great. So my question was about the difference between national bonds and the M bond. Well, specifically, I wrote about the M bond, but the subject-specific bonds. I understand the general difference, but what would you say, me as an NGO, should I contact the regional bond, the national bond, the area-specific bonds? Where do they overlap in some cases? Because obviously there is some overlapping in data collection and analysis. So if you could go a bit into that, I would love that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, sort of very pragmatic and important to understand. So that, as I said before, that there's often very strong national representation in these thematic bonds, and some countries obviously can contribute more times of energy and sometimes even financial support. So the Marine Bond has a secretariat. That secretariat's job is not just to support the efforts of mobilizing marine monitoring in any one country, but to support in an umbrella effort the efforts of many that are monitoring marine systems around the world. So their scope, their spatial scope, is international. They have They also have their own working groups. Sometimes they have a task force that might, for example, connect to OBIS, right? The information system, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System, or to GOOS, the Global Ocean Observing System. And so MBON has been very strong in providing a weighty implementation of that knowledge and linking it into GOOS and OBIS, which has allowed a pathway of essential ocean variables and those EBVs that are relevant to oceans into the marine bond community and then into OBIS and to GOOS. So it's trying to represent that effort rather than an implementation, for example, of a national bond that would have marine representations. You'd have marine bond representation in a France bond, right? And then IFREMER or whatever it is, there's some sort of marine institute that's on the south coast that's trying to monitor EBVs. They would be doing that for their national interest, but would be also linking to the thematic one. I'll just close on the soil bond because maybe that's the most recent. So soil bond emerged from a contribution of a few soil biologists. One of them was one of the co-chairs based in IDIV in Leipzig in Germany, and said, hey, we need to get together the soil community and provide a service that allows them to share samples, provide a systematic measurement and quantification of the diversity of those soil samples, and then share that knowledge. So they're sharing protocols, they're sharing data, and they're coordinating webinars and thematic sessions and EBVs and publishing papers on how to bring together that community. And they're a very nice recent model for, I think, a movement bond, which is clearly thematic in its first framing.
Wonderful. Well,
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Omar. Thank you so much, Andy, for that wonderful overview. Thanks for the questions to the community. We're going to now move on to Aidin. So Aidin, if you want to get your screen up, I'll do a short introduction to you as well. We're excited to be joined by Dr. Aidin Niamir, head of the Data and Knowledge Unit at IPBES and head of the International Science Policy Unit at Senckenberg. Aidin's work is at the forefront of connecting biodiversity data with global decision-making, ensuring robust scientific knowledge informs international conservation policies. His leadership within IPBES provides critical insights into the mechanisms that guide global biodiversity governance, making his perspective really an invaluable contribution, also as an important advisor to the Move Bond initiative, and kind of guiding us as we're exploring how our community can effectively engage with these processes. So Aidin, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Talia, for such a nice introduction. Thanks, Lacey, WildLabs, for offering this series of talks. And as I always said, it's very difficult to present something after Andrew. After Andy, he set the standards very high, and it would be always a challenge to also present something like even closer to the standard that Andy sets. Anyway, today I would like to talk about more policy aspects and also look at how policy, science policy platforms like IPBES works. But before that, I would like to just ask you all to imagine 1 second what happens in this room. They play totally different rules. This is just a sample of a picture that I found on internet. This is not IPBES. I think it would be one of the general assemblies or so. So the rules in this room, when we say negotiations, are totally different than the way that we scientists communicate, talk, negotiate. We listen to each other, we try to look at the proofs, etc. And if you consider every single of these seats a country, a member, maybe a scientific community will be somewhere at the end, somewhere here. I don't know whether you can see my mouse. At the very end, somewhere sitting and not even allowed to talk unless a party or a member offer or second the floor. So this is what, when we say negotiations, when we say science policy, at the end, the decision making is happening in a very, I would say, fast, but in the meantime, very slow process. So opportunities comes, and then if we don't get it, it will be postponed in a very, very different way. So for example, if if we want to propose something to a plenary, there should be a preparation, either a draft of decision, a preparations, then at least a few months for the Secretariat to prepare on any of these platforms. Then in the next plenary, they decide whether to consider it in another plenary. So we are already losing at least 1 or 2 years for a decision to be, or a topic to be approved or decision to be made. So I think, as Andy wrapped up at the end, scientific voices, science and this community, they need to streamline their voices. And these are the tools that would be very, very important to make sure that we, as a scientist, also have our voice there and be heard, and also have an impact on the process of decision making and policy setting. Okay. With that, now I'm coming back to IPBES. In our last presentation, in the last session of this series, we had Gillian from CBD and also Dagmar from CMS. CBD stands for Convention of Biological Diversity, and CMS stands for Convention of Migratory Species. And by the way, when you register, you add the questions on the registration. That was very, very helpful to adjust the presentation. So now I'm just few hours before this session, I decided to cut and trim several slides and add more. So I hope that I now adjusted to most of the questions that has been posted during registration. Those are conventions, and conventions are those kind of international agreements or treaties that the member states at the end sit together and then they sign, or they kind of agree, and then the kind of the membership to that conventions are most of the time being rectified by a body, a legal body within that territory or country. So in these conventions, policymakers, country representative will sit and they decide on the topics. But then in platforms like IPBES, and IPBES stands for Intergovernmental, it's very clear that we have several governments and territories involved. It's a science policy platform, so means that the intention is to bridge the gaps and also make a dialogue between these two community. It's a platform, not a convention, and by platform means that there are different kind of desired objectives and functions are assigned to this platform. In the climate world, we have IPCC, and that's an intergovernmental panel. This one is intergovernmental platform. So the function of IPBES goes beyond just producing, let's say, assessment on a periodical basis. They also mandated for other objectives, which I come to that in a few minutes. So in IPBES, we have an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Then, as in one of also Andy's presentation, you see it says science for people and nature. So the focus is on people and nature, and the view in IPBES is that nature and people are in one body. So sometimes even people are part of nature. It's not like a distinct component for people. It's an independent intergovernmental body. It's not affiliated or being supported by any non-governmental organization or institutions to maintain its independency. It's very new. It's very young. It's 2012 compared to IPCC, which goes back to 1988, 89. At the moment, we have almost 150 member states. To be exact, I think 149. And the idea is that it provides options for response and policy relevant knowledge, at harness expertise across disciplines and diverse knowledge system. So what will happen in practice? Let's look at the rolling work program first. So IPBES is a dynamic platform. So government sits together, say, okay, what are our needs? basically the request comes from governments. They said, we would like to know more on how to handle invasive alien species, on how to control them. We would like to know, for example, how we can better, for example, deal with pollinators, or sustainable use of wildlife. Or, for example, in the context of CBD and the biodiversity framework, then the CBD, the governments, the member states says in the CBD that we should now ask IPBES to run a specific methodological assessment on this framework, for example. And then that was one of the bases for the monitoring assessment that Andy is co-chairing that assessment. In rolling program of IPBES, and the reason that we call rolling program because it's not repetitive. Every single assessment is unique, is a unique assessment of its own kind. And at IPBES, there is nearly, not nearly, absolutely, there is no assessment that being repeated. It's all new assessments that has been requested by governments. The rolling program of IPBES up to 2030 has a very wide overall objective, and that is to strengthen policy interface for biodiversity ecosystem services, for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and you see that human and people now come to the picture, and sustainable development. IPBES has several objectives. The most known objective is assessing knowledge. So all of these IPBES assessments, all the reports that has been produced, global assessments, regional assessments, monitoring assessment, these are the outcome of objective 1. And the reason that I emphasized on a platform part of the IPBES is that there are other objectives in this platform. So capacity building is a platform. Governments ask this platform to build capacity to get for example, to utilize the knowledge from diverse disciplines across regions for the work of IPBES. Or, for example, we have another objective on knowledge, strengthening the knowledge foundation. There are two specific task force working on this objective. For example, one of them is indigenous local knowledge, which is specifically mandated by governments to bring that knowledge system into IPBES process. Supporting policy is another very important function or objective of the platform. So what shall we do? Now we have these assessments. They offered us, they clarified options. Now what would be next? How can we now take it and apply it at our national level? And of course, as always, communication engagement to be inclusive, to have all the stakeholders on board. IPBES has a big stakeholder network, a lot of observer institutes to get involved and have a say into the work of IPBES. Very simply, mapping how IPBES works, we have a plenary on the top. That is a decision-making body of the platform. All the decision is made by plenary. They meet once a year. So it was just few weeks ago in December, we met in Namibia, Windhoek, for the 11th time. That was IPBES 11 in Namibia. Then in plenary, assessments being discussed, being approved, being negotiated, next program being so it's a decision-making body of the assessment. There are a set of observers attending in the plenary, and also a lot of stakeholders will participate in the plenary. But then, since plenary meets every year, they kind of delegate tasks to two other bodies. One is Bureau, which are people, experts selected and nominated by the governments to make sure that the platform runs based on all agreed protocols. And there is also multidisciplinary expert panel, MEP. These are also experts nominated by government across regions to make sure that the content the topics are being delivered to the highest standard or highest possible, and they maintain the content. Bureau maintains the function of the platform. Then all these things are on the shoulder of expert groups and task forces. The way that they, in this figure, we see that it seems like the experts groups and task forces are relatively, I mean, if we just want to say there's a scale to the number of people, these are the biggest group of the platform. All the authors of the assessment, everything that comes from the assessment reports, all the task force members, they are sitting in this group, and the entire platform is being supported by a secretariat. Since 2016, IPBES delivered its first series of assessment reports, pollinators, and then scenario models in 2016, followed by four regional assessments and land degradation assessment. Then in 2019, IPBES delivered its landmark first global assessment, and then with a two-year delay, in 2022, we had sustainable use of wildlife and values assessment delivered. 2023 was a year that invasive alien species being approved and delivered, and just a few weeks ago in Windhoek, after long negotiations, two new assessments. One is on nexus assessment, which is interlink among biodiversity, water, food, and health. As you see now that the topics are going beyond biodiversity. It's also involve water, it involves food, it involves health. This is the function of this platform, and as well as transformative change. So if we just want to say how these assessment reports look like, when we say assessment report, what we are talking about. These are like big reports, but of course a summary for policymakers, SPM, usually 40 to 50, very colorful, full of nice photos and pictures, very short sentences, simplified version of science, understandable and punchy, while authors do their best to avoid being prescriptive, but very relevant and offering options for the policymakers. That is the type of different type of writing that we scientists are not used to. We would like to be very accurate with what we believe. And then these summary for policymakers, which are about 50 pages, are based on set of core chapters. And core chapters, like some assessment has 4 or 5, some assessment has more or less, and we are talking about about 1,000 pages. And these are the type of text that we use to. It's a very scientific text, more synthesizing the accessible knowledge. And of course, all these chapters are being supported by a set of bibliographic and references behind figures, maps, and all the synthesis that authors do during the assessment. There are data management reports documenting, explaining the process. For example, if there is a figure derived from 2-3 layers and an R function behind that would be something that will go on data management reports. Then we have all assessment has a glossary, sometimes set of fact sheets on like cross-cutting topics, and of course knowledge gaps. And knowledge gaps recently is being part of the SPM, so being negotiated and approved by the plenary. Looking at the indicative timeline up to 2030, as I said, we just delivered Nexus and Transformative Change, the first two in IPBES 11, we just passed in the first 2 lines. The third line is Business and Biodiversity Assessment, which is ongoing, and it's expected to be delivered next IPBES, in IPBES 12, which most likely will take place in early 2026 in UK. And then We have another ongoing assessment, which is monitoring and monitoring biodiversity, nature's contribution to people. That says year 1 now in ongoing assessment. This is the one that Andy co-chairs. Then we have second global assessment that is planned to start this year, and also spatial planning and ecological connectivity, which also very relevant to this topic of MoveBon, which will start in the coming months. So these are the planned and ongoing assessment. There is one free slot in the for IPBES to adopt in one new assessment and deliver it by 2030. Still at the negotiations, and we don't know what would be the topic. It could be anything from pollutions to energy, etc. So we should wait and see what would be the outcome of IPBES 12. Okay, now I try to say that what a platform like IPBES would, how MoveBon, initiatives like MoveBon can contribute to the work of IPBES. Reflecting back to the plenary picture that I presented at the beginning of my slide, I think from that perspective, one of the biggest achievement of MoveBon is potentially to establish a scientific community for consensus building. In a platforms in IPBES or CBD, consensus is everything. So you need to be inclusive to when you propose anything. You need to have everybody on board and come up with a inclusive way. That's why we lack such a community now on a movement ecology, and that would be one of the biggest mission of MoveBon, to kind of gather all the experts in the field and represent or come up with a framework that represents the community, to foster internal discussions, researches. So we discuss everything among ourselves, but then we offer something as a community agreed kind of consensus to the policymakers. And then that would be, of course, an input to IPBES assessment, and Andy clarified it very clearly. And then the topic of variables, GEO BON call it essential other communities. I mean, outside biodiversity and ecosystem, they sometimes say key, the other groups say core. It doesn't matter. Just we need to come up with a set of key, core, essential variables that at the community level you say that these are the variables that we believe that could represent the status of the system, and of course should be open and fair in a production workflow. And then, as they were discussed, that it should be also accessible in a way that not being limited to some certain countries or center institutes. At the end, it should be useful and applicable for the broader parties. And then when we have these variables, it's relatively easy to connect to policy relevant, to make it policy relevant, to put it in the context of target and come up with an indicator to measure the progress toward those targets, and etc. I think by that, I will wrap up my presentation. Just I would like to use an opportunity to invite colleagues in the call, and also encourage everybody to circulate the call. Just a few days ago, there was a call now open for nomination of expert for the second global assessment. That's a very big assessment. It's planned to start this year for 4 years. And that would be very important that colleagues from this community try to nominate themselves either at governmental nomination or through GEO BON. GEO BON nominates people on a regular basis to IPBES. Please contact the Secretariat of GEO BON, and if you're interested, try to seek nomination from organization and governments. This would be a very valuable input to the second global assessment of IPBES. And by that, I would like to say thank you and hope to see MoveBon and along to GeoBon, which always is very vital and active in the work of IPBES, in one of these pictures soon. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aidin. That was super helpful. We'll have a couple of questions, I think, from the chat and from our side, just specifically following up on this talk, and then we'll invite Andy to come back for a full discussion with us. So to kick us off, I know with Andy's questions, we got pretty specifically into the movement space, which I think is really helpful. And it's definitely a focus of this series, but I want to remember we also have a broader community of technologists and innovators and scientists who are engaging through Wild Labs and other outlets. So I'm just curious, Aidin, if you can reflect a little bit on the role of the conservation technology space in IPBES work and assessments, and how this kind of rapidly evolving landscape is affecting this science to policy translation, and what IPBES can do with the data that's being produced and supported by all these different technologies.
Yeah, I'm catching up with the text, and sorry, I didn't get your question clearly, but if I understand the question correctly, the general response to that would be that in IPBES there is no new kind of new research, or IPBES does not run research. It's just synthesizing the current available knowledge. Therefore, I think in this specific question that deals with the technology, I'm not pretty sure how can I link it to IPBES. Maybe Andy, you know that better, but for example, in methodological assessments that it's going to deliver, for example, methods behind the monitoring, that component will be part of the assessment, but comes from the available peer-reviewed publications through the assessment reports. So IPBES as a platform will not dive into these things, as it will be through peer-reviewed materials to the assessments.
That makes sense. Or like the community producing the science that's leveraging all these technological advancements to feed into the IPBES assessments rather than like a direct connection. Andy, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Only to agree, indeed, that the scope of the monitoring assessment really is based on the evidence that we have today and is in the peer-reviewed and grey literature. I think this means that there are opportunities for other organizations to bring together the relevant knowledge. So even before the IPBES assessment, or even before in the lead up to COP15, GeoBon produced a number of science briefs that were dedicated to key questions that negotiators were looking for. They were incredibly successful, have been downloaded thousands of times. They're all freely available on the GeoBon website, and they were kind of a mini assessment process done on a very accelerated timescale, literally 6 months kind of timescale. So they're not definitive, but they provided, the timing was just great. And I think it's there where other organizations can complement the work of IPBES.
Okay, that's really helpful.
Alia, I see two questions from Rebecca, which I would like to quickly address if it's okay.
Do you mind if for the recording I can ask them for Rebecca, and then you can respond just so folks on the recording can see. It looks like maybe the first one was somewhat answered, but we can come back to it as well. The second one was, Aidin, could you possibly outline the methodology for producing an IPBES assessment report? For example, does it look like a systematic literature review of academic journals and grey literature, or does it also include novel or distinct data collection from IPBES?
Yeah, I will be very, very short on this one. So also a bit to the first topic that it said, is there any database for these requests? So IPBES issues a call and then says that governments, platforms, if you would like us to run an assessment, please submit these requests. Most of the time, request comes from conventions like CBD, submit a set of titles and requests. In the last CBD in Cali, there was a list of 12 requests. Then other conventions, CMS, CITES, all conventions had the opportunity, Ramsar, to submit a request to Secretariat of IPBES. Governments can submit requests, NGOs, any institutes can officially submit requests to Secretariat of IPBES. Secretariat of IPBES reviews these requests, prepare a document, and then deliveries to the plenary. All these processes are public, so reports of the plenary are public. There is no data sets behind that, but if you look at the reports, documentation of the plenary, they are available. Then plenary decides based on a recommendation of MEP and Bureau that, for example, these three are the highest priority, and then they go forward and they decide on a topic. Then, as soon as they decided on a topic, then they invite scientific community to say how to do that assessment. Then we call it, or they call it, a scoping phase. It means that we know the topic, but we also would like to consult scientific community to set up the term of reference, the methods, and what they expect to be seen to do in this assessment. Then the scoping report includes not only the outline of the chapters, the methods, the references, where to get data, to whom to involve, how many people to involve, everything being discussed in a year of a scoping phase. And the people and experts sitting in this panel are being selected by governments, nominated by scientific community. Then they review this scoping document. Sometimes it takes 2 years. Then they go back and forth, say, yes, this is what we want. By this, we might get what we ask for. After negotiations, cutting, trimming, adding chapters, removing chapters, then they agree on a scoping report. That scoping report clarifies the entire methods behind running that assessment. That's why there is no like a standard document. For every single assessment, there would be different scoping documents, and the scoping document is not only the outline, also methods. I think that should answer Rebecca's second question. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Aidin. One more question from registration is, does IPBES have metrics or targets that are equivalent to the climate/IPCC reports?
I'm not sure what if I understand the metrics, but in IPCC there are like assessment cycles. Now we just started 7th assessment cycle or assessment report, and there are working groups that work on that assessment reports plus spatial reports based on the request of the plenary. In IPBES, as I said, every single assessment is unique, so we cannot compare, or it's not possible, and it's not even fair to compare, for example, invasive alien species assessment with transformative change assessment. It's comparing apple and watermelon. Is totally different, because the team, the experts, the expertise, even the narration, the tone, the request, all are unique. That's why it would be a bit difficult to compare these two, but plenary specifically requested now for a measure and metrics to measure the effectiveness of these assessments. And this is very, very tough task for us at the Secretariat to come up with a KPI, key performance indicator, to measure, okay, all these things that we do, the entire platform does, how effective they are. Maybe this would be something that is relevant to the question, but these are under the negotiation as has not been published yet.
Yeah, I think that's extremely relevant. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aidin. We're going to wrap up this specific session here and move on to the broader discussion, but just a huge thank you again for your talk and for responding to these questions. So Andy, if you want to jump back in with us, Lacey, do you want to kick us off with the first discussion question?
Sure. So I think there's actually several questions kind of on this theme, and you both spent some time on this, but could you just reiterate or reemphasize the points of engagement for scientists for IPBES and I guess, global biodiversity framework processes?
Sure. Maybe I'll just jump in quickly. So one is through engagement with networks like GEO BON, but it could also be IUCN or other science-based networks that are represented as observers in the CBD process. So when I say observer, that's a status. That means you can sit in on a plenary like that first photo that Aidin showed, that formal kind of UN setting, and observers sit in the background, and they are they can be invited to take the floor after the parties have spoken, and they can contribute knowledge. So often what's happening in that room is that you're holding a position that's shared and representing the position of your network, like GEO BON or IUCN or whoever it is, or an NGO, for example, big NGOs. And so these non-state actors have a role to play, and science is at the table. So for GEO BON, for example, to make a case that in future COPs where my movement might come up, or at CMS or others, there is an opportunity there for that voice to be made. Where does that come from? That comes from a commitment by an organization like GEO BON to represent the work, for example, of its task force or working group on movement. So you see there's a flow from the activities of the scientists, their collective agreement on what has been done and what needs to be done, and then passed on into the negotiation process. Now that's one workflow. The other is within the UN CBD process is called SBSTTA, SBSTTA, which is a kind of a subsidiary body, and the UN CBD has subsidiary bodies, as does the UNFCCC. And that is for science, technical, and technological input. That's what the STT stands for. So now this is more like a more pointy opportunity to bring into that context presentations. There are mini sessions like these that happen in SBSTTA where a community can collaborate and bring movement to the fore. Now, and the people who are in that room are often parties with their relevant representatives in the room, and you can have a dialogue and really share what's happening. So I would start probably with let's say a MoveBon is set up, we're a year and a half down the line, you want to be at SBSTTA. And then if we're ready for something very strategic, and we know that on the agenda, monitoring framework is on the agenda, and we want to make something very strong about the model of movement, then, maybe it's not COP17, but maybe it's the next COP. You can start to begin to milestone how we engage at that kind of international policy dialogue. I'll stop there because I don't want to keep on talking, but obviously there's a similar process that happens regionally. So if you're in Europe or North America or in Southeast Asia, there are other platforms or even nationally. And so the effort is really building, it's core that we build this vibrant community that you are doing incredibly well. And that community uses all the channels available for contributing the consensus and communicating the readiness of the community to help.
Perfect. Aidin.
Yeah, was there anything you wanted to add, Aidin?
Just to emphasize again that there are, except for example, assessing knowledge or to contribute scientifically, there are also other ways that, for example, I saw that recently there are a lot of scientists and early career scientists sitting behind the seats of country delegations. So now, because of all these things that become more diverse, very specialized, so one representative from government, coming from the specific ministry, cannot answer and deal with all aspects. Therefore, now it's getting more and more common that countries invite experts to sit and to be sent to these meetings as a delegation for negotiation. So it's not only to write these reports, but also to be involved and contribute to the negotiation of these reports, to provide scientific input to the. So therefore, when there are review process in most of these documents, most of these platforms, there are review process. There are opportunities for scientific community, for organizations to submit their comments, to say if they spot anything. They are, and I always remember the marine community. Then when we were doing global assessment, there was very few in the team, and marine was not really part of the assessment, because on that time IPCC had a special report on marine, on oceans. But then they did a great job, like Marine Bon, MBON. They did a great job, as well as other marine community people. They tried to push, and now, even in the last negotiation, there was a discussion to have an like independent chapter in global assessment for oceans and marine. So I think representativeness in all aspects, through capacity building, policy support, communications, these are way of contributing and not only becoming an author and writing a paragraph.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Building on kind of that last point, and something you both talked about in your presentations about the importance of capacity building and community building and coordination of efforts, which is also obviously very closely aligned with WildLabs work and the bond communities that we're trying to support. I'm curious, Andy, you mentioned these CBD, technical and scientific cooperation sub-regional support centers, I think they're called, that are kind of tasked with this technical capacity building and coordination work at the regional and sub-regional levels. Can you both speak a little bit more about how GeoBon and IPBES are engaging with these centers or planning to engage with them, and how you see bonds, including MoveBon, working with them effectively?
We're at a very early stage in this engagement process, Talia, and nothing has been formalized yet. We had conversations, I should say, the GeoBon Secretariat had conversations at COP16 with the Secretariat of GBIF, for example, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, about a joint effort to communicate and engage with each of those centers, and then provide learning support. So building capacity within those regional centers, so then they have a level of capacity to support countries who are part of their kind of regional watershed, if you like, or their scope, their geographic scope. And we haven't set that up yet, but there is a certain amount of enthusiasm within the two, GBIF and GeoBon, to do that. As we head towards our own Living Data conference later in October of this year, where GBIF, GeoBon, TADWIG, and others will come together to kind of redesign the data landscape so that there's a much greater collaboration, formalized collaboration. And so then once that's better known, I think the intent, therefore, is to work with these regional centers to find dedicated budget to do that, and human capacity to do that. Katie, I see Katie, our Executive Secretary at GeoBon, is being very diligent in dropping in the relevant links. We encourage you all to register and head to Bogota for the Living Data conference. My last point would be that these regional centers are leaning on other national centers. And so those national centers, if you already have a relationship with a national center, then there's another way into that process. It doesn't necessarily have to be kind of top down through GeoBon and GBIF, right? And so we can kind of triangulate our approach. The CBD Secretariat has started something called Dialogues, which is a an engagement process that allows parties to the CBD to benefit from webinars and online training. And so GeoBon will be just trying to be part of those dialogues. And so if we have a clear MoveBon working group and there's something that the movement gang want to be able to say as part of those dialogues, that's another opportunity. Now, it doesn't matter if we miss this boat, there'll be future commitments between now and 2030, of course. So watch this space. This is something we think is a huge opportunity to sort of make the challenge more manageable by breaking it down into these centers and working with these 23 regional centers.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we're really excited to hear about these centers too from the Wild Labs perspective, because we've been dreaming of something like it and trying to figure out how it's going to happen. So very exciting to hear. Aidin, do you want to add anything to that?
Not really. It falls outside the mandate and the scope of IPBES completely. So IPBES is not involved. But from just another perspective, or looking at technically, so when we have a MoveBon coming, for example, with a set of a bundle of indicators, set of indicators, and also the workflow behind generating those indicators, hopefully, then a mandate or kind of a scope of work of these regional centers would be to customize or to regionalize that workflow to the needs of the region, and then again push it back, for example, for that specific region to platforms like One in a Box or etc. So it's also, although it's coming from the global workflow, but it's customized to the need of the region. Then the countries can use it like to breaking down the global national level to one step at the regional step. Yeah.
Okay, great. One quick notice, because we have a smaller group today, just an invitation, if anyone wants to turn their cameras on and have more of like an open conversation, please feel free to do that. Lacey, do you want to take the question in the chat?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, Eva is asking, what are the most helpful decision support tools or data browsers or data products for decision makers?
That's a great question. So there are the platforms that are most regularly used, and then there are platforms that will be most useful. And we're seeing a sort of shift right now. So GeoBon, for example, offers an EBV portal. That EBV portal provides free access to data layers that are contributed by the community. And that EBV portal that you can, I'm sure Katie can drop it into the URL, can drop that into the chat. And that's a community contributed set of data layers that often involve the end product of a data analysis workflow that can then be used by indicator workflows. So often, as I showed in my Bon in a Box platform very quickly, there's an EBV pipeline and then there is an indicator pipeline. And the indicator pipeline often needs an EBV work product. So that's one, but I wouldn't say that countries use that platform. That is for the research community, designed by the research community. So where you'll see countries are looking for high-level how to implement, use indicators. So for example, UNEP WCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, based in Cambridge in the UK, provides the metadata sheets that describe the indicators and how those indicators are, what their methodologies are, what data sets are available, and how to implement that. So countries would go to that. And then, of course, there's an enormous amount of use of global data platforms like GBIF, and likely MoveBank and other data repositories that are public facing and that have established a certain standard. And we acknowledge that there's a tension between those big global repositories having data from a highly biased set of countries in terms of large volumes of data coming from 10 countries. 80% of the data in GBIF comes from 10 countries, and those 10 countries are historically wealthy countries that are invested in monitoring biodiversity. And much of that data is for birds. So to a first approximation, GBIF is for birds, for 10 countries, even though you see there are billions of observations, 3 billion observations in GBIF. So GBIF can't be the only game in town, nor OBIS or others. We have to have these other portals and repositories. And so I think MoveBank is a huge opportunity, but there are no doubt national examples of that. So first of all, platforms that facilitate understanding of indicators, platforms that make available workflows in open, free, fair ways, and then those that help to mobilize those indicators in country or in a region. So the more we can connect those 3 types of repositories and knowledge sharing platforms, the better, which is, we noticed at GeoBon there was a gap in this workflow repository space, that it wasn't very easy to get code or scripts in any language, stitch them together to take raw data and turn that into an indicator. So that's why we built that. We're building the Bon in a Box platform and its associated community.
That's answered. Yeah, I think this has been a question we've been kind of bouncing around and thinking about. If we do have an indicator that comes out of MoveBon,
Yeah.
where is it going to be hosted? So
yeah,
at this point, there isn't necessarily a single place that like all countries writing an NBSAT, National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, are going to for indicator data. It's kind of dispersed.
For indicator data?
I guess indicator, well, you could answer both. the derived indicator is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll take Canada because that's probably the one I know the best. So Canada for any given indicator, for example, Living Planet, right? Living Planet Index is one of those indicators. Many countries like it. It's been heavily supported with a communications effort over the years, and it's recognized as an indicator. So there's a Living Planet portal and Living Planet database. The LPD is different from the LPI, the index itself. So there's a science community that's publishing the LPI, it's peer reviewed, and you can go to the relevant website and download how to calculate, that. And there are R scripts that will calculate it for you. But the LPD, the database of time series of populations that countries would use, exists, but it's heavily geographically and taxonomically biased. So then Canada, for example, then worked with the Zoological Society of London to build a Canadian bespoke LPD for Canada. So now it's working with those folks who have the relevant knowledge case to build the relevant data set to calculate and update the LPI for Canada. And it'll take many years for that to have good representation taxonomically and geographically for Canada. So imagine now emulating that for movement. So you imagine a national MoveBank repository that's got as much community-led, researcher-led monitoring of movement. Those movement data sets are freely available and will be part of a national effort to calculate a movement indicator. And as you all know, for now, the dominant indicators are those that are about calculating the connectivity among protected areas like ProtCon and others. They are often structural connectivity and are not commonly using a wide range of movement data. That's a gap. And so the extent that we can offer a MoveBank national, global, and the appropriate workflows for indicators that use that movement data, if you can set that up in the next year or two, you're gold, because countries will start noticing that. And then it's a question of repeat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that led perfectly into one of the big questions we had for you, that also came through a little bit in different pieces of registration questions. But if we do have a movement indicator like this, even the connectivity indicators we're seeing are not being adopted so far as headline indicators, meaning that they're optional for parties to report on. So if we assume it's not a given that a movement indicator would be adopted as a headline indicator, how do we motivate engagement with it and adoption of it by parties?
Okay.
And we'd love to hear both. Yeah, your thoughts too, but both of you.
Yeah, Aidin, do you want to jump in? Because I answered
No,
first.
this perfectly fits to your expertise. Andy, please go ahead.
At the highest level, if discussions on the monitoring framework are being held at COP, if they've followed through from SBSTA and it was identified as an issue, SBSTA makes a recommendation, yes, there should be something on monitoring connectivity, that would be an opportunity in the plenary context to contribute information. But in the lead up to all of that more formal, heavily formal process, we need to demonstrate and broadly democratize this idea that this indicator is necessary, is reliable, can be used by as many countries as possible, not just Northwestern Europe and the Northern Hemisphere usual suspects, and that it's not too technical, because if it's too technical, it can't be a headline. Then it falls into a component or complementary, which is great because countries can choose to report those, and countries can also use national indicators. So those national indicators could be that widely commonly used. It could be the same indicator in each case, but because it's a nationally supported effort, they're not required to do it. But many countries in their NBSAPs will include national indicators because they trust them more. They trust the data and they trust that it's adapted to their needs. So, Canada has a connectivity response. It's part of its strategy and plan, working with the connectivity community. It's been using things like CircuitScape and others to create these layers. You'll be very familiar with them, and that's part of a legitimate way in which connectivity is incorporated into Canada's plan for nature, strategy plan for nature. So two streams: one working within the country makes it part of its national strategy, and then the slower, heavy, more sustained effort required to get it into SBSTA, into an SBI, and in and on into a negotiating process. But it has to happen through the monitoring framework task.
Talia, Lacey, I just wanted to add something to the question before was Eva, and that was specifically from the policymaker's point of view, and not necessarily decision makers' point of view. I could imagine that most of the colleagues in this call and this community are going to be mostly young, early career, because it's a new topic, and we also need to maintain our positions. So why do we spend our time on these activities rather than trying to publish in a high journal, etc.? So I just want to highlight that policy impacts are also getting nicely traced now. So now with having all the policy documents documented and indexed, it's pretty easy and it's doable now, and the policy platforms are moving towards that to also publish a scientific policy impacts. So as a scientist, as an early career scientist, as a young scientist that we would like to need to write the proposals, apply for funds, etc., we can easily show that our work have an impact at the scientific as a policy. So it's a policy impact more or less equivalent to scientific impacts, the same concepts in calculations. And then there are also tools that we can report and measure on that. There is a pilot between GBIF and IPBES, and very soon with IUCN and IPBES, that we try to report even one single contribution by a single occurrence to GBIF, how they contributed to the assessment, like IPBES. And nowadays, funding agencies also are opening the calls mainly by the knowledge gaps identified in these platforms. So having and contributing to these platforms in these science policy interfaces also helpful in setting up and increasing the visibility and credit of applications in grant, for grant writing and etc.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for those responses. I think, Andy, that's really helpful for us to think about the process and how we approach this big. I think sometimes the policy world can feel so like a black box that we're still trying to understand. So it's really helpful to hear your insights there. And Aidin, that was really well aligned with the next question we were actually going to ask you about, this kind of almost cultural divide between the policy and scientific space. And it seems, even just based on the registration questions, which I know the four of us all looked at, There's so much enthusiasm and interest from this scientific and technical community to contribute to policy and seeing the importance, but really kind of like a lack of understanding of how to best do that. So I hope that this session has been helpful in kind of laying the groundwork for that. And I think for us and Lacey and I, as we're working through MOVE bond development, it's really a critical piece of the puzzle to understand. So thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your thoughtful contributions. Yeah. For everyone, just a heads up that the registration link is not quite up for the next event, but it will be on February 19th. And it will focus on data and information access with presentations from GBIF and Bon in a Box that were both mentioned today. So hopefully a nice follow on to this discussion. Thank you so much all for being here, and we will see you next time.